It's remarkable how many people think that the .308 Winchester and the .30-06 Springfield are very similar cartridges. In reality, they're real different. Each of them has its own set of features and characteristics. So, which is best? Welcome to the Backcountry Hunting Podcast, folks. I'm Joseph Von Benedict, your host, and today we're going to explore that question. What's better for your purposes, .308 Winchester or the grand old .30-06? First though, let's go to our upfront Q&A section and answer a question submitted by Brent via Patreon. I'm going to read that on my computer here, and then we'll answer it before digging into the .30-06 versus .308 debate. Okay, so Brent wrote in, and he said he's military, stationed in Colorado. Thank you for your service, my friend. Much appreciated. He says, I've never hunted before, and I plan on hunting this fall and to try and make the most out of my opportunities here in Colorado. He says he's got two questions. The first one is he's got a 7mm 08 rifle, and he's found, I presume while researching, mixed results about hunting elk with it. The rifle is a Ruger American Gen 2, so it's a nice new rifle, right? He says, is it enough cartridge to do it? Meaning, I presume, hunt elk. And if so, what bullet would you recommend? I understand that this caliber would keep me with a max of 400 yards, and even then may be pushing it. The second question I had was preparing for a solo hunt and what a first-timer needs. He says he's got some training and some old gear from the military, but he is on a bit of a budget. So, Brent, great question. Thank you for submitting it. And I'll do my best. It's pretty broad subject, two subjects really. The second one, what kind of gear and so forth is needed to prepare for your first solo hunt. But we'll try and condense it into a useful answer here. So I responded and said the 7mm 08 is on the light side for elk, but it's also 100% capable. Just to be sure and use a high quality controlled expansion bullet. Preferably one on the heavy for caliber side if you're using a lead core bullet. If it's a monometal, that's not as necessary. So I said any monometal by Barnes, Hornady, or Federal or whatnot would be great. And I'm talking like the 139 grains and up, right? I said other excellent choices, saying the bonded core bullet family would be Nosler's AccuBond, Federal's Trophy bonded tip or terminal ascent bullet, the Swift A-frame, and so forth. Nosler's partition, of course, is always excellent. It's a different type of construction, but a very good controlled expansion bullet. And then I attempted to answer his solo hunting question and gear-related inquiry, right? I said, you really don't need expensive modern gear. You just need solid gear, and you do need the essentials. If you're backpacking and camping, of course, you're going to need a bit more gear than if you're camping out of the back of your truck. Most crucial is, of course, what he's already working on, a well-sighted rifle with good ammunition, good optics, so your binocular and your rifle scope are the two primary ones, and a good rangefinder, good boots that are properly broke in, and a healthy dose of common sense. I wrote back to Brent. He said use paper topo maps and or Onyx Hunt app to navigate. And I really recommend getting well versed with both. Get really proficient with both Onyx maps and those topographical maps. They're not as common these days among hunters, but man, an old hunter with a lot of woodsmanship skills that knows how to read a topographical map. Remember, it spreads it out much bigger. You can pencil things in on it. You can see more of the overall situation than when you're looking at a little phone screen. So those can be a real advantage. I told him to borrow or buy a solid backpack that's comfortable and that's robust enough to carry elk quarters in. Pack a life straw for emergency water, and if he's camping, meaning backpacking in, use a quality lightweight tent, sleeping bag, and pad, and finally get a jet well. personally speaking, that's the most efficient, best functioning backpacking type stove that I've used. And that's really about it, folks. I mean, I grew up going to the Army surplus stores to get my hunting and backpacking gear. I did not have high-tech clothing, packs, anything except optics. I always made a point of having good optics after I found out that I have really, like, overly sensitive optical nerves, and that has made a big difference. Okay, I'm getting over a bit of a cold here. I apologize for the extra sound and maybe a weird sounding voice, but it is what it is. Before attacking a question as significant as the 30-06 versus 308 debate, we probably should take a minute and define it. What are we trying to figure out here? Well, first we need to know, is there actually really a difference? A lot of folks will tell you that, it's only 100 feet per second slower and the deer downrange is never going to know the difference. And you know what? If the guy is hunting white-tailed deer in traditional white-tailed deer habitat, he's absolutely correct. For deer hunting inside 300 yards, there is no difference, I would say. The differences come, or perhaps we should attack this differently. How do we define where the differences become important? I believe the differences become important when ranges increase and game becomes bigger. So we're talking elk, moose, perhaps interior grizzly bear, the bigger black bears, and so forth. In that case, is there more of a difference between the 308 and the 30-06? I maintain that there is, and I hope to be able to show you that there is. There's a distinct advantage that goes to the 30-06 in those cases. However, the 308 has its own set of advantages. It is distinctly more inherently accurate. And if you really want to just place shots carefully and precisely in the field out to 300 yards, you're better off with a 308, especially for deer-sized game, even a bit bigger. Let's call it caribou-sized game and smaller. Now, why isn't the 308 as good on bigger game if it shoots the same diameter bullets, just only 100 feet per second faster? We're going to get to that here in a minute, folks. Okay, so let's start with the 30-06 because it is the senior cartridge, and we're going to explore all of its characteristics and talk about specifications of the cartridge as far as, well, everything we can dig up here. I'm going to consult my notes. First, the lifespan difference between the two. The 30-06 was introduced in 1906. The 308 Winchester was introduced in 1952. So, what is that? About a 46-year, nearly a half-century gap between the two of them. Just a fun little bit of trivia to start this off with. Next, the 30-06 is a long-action cartridge. Really, it's called a standard length cartridge, the 308 being a short action, and a truly long cartridge like a 375 H&H Magnum or the 300 PRC. The 30-06 falls in the middle, so let's call it a standard length cartridge. It's 3.34 inches from base to tip is the standard overall length. Of course, that varies depending on your load, and hand loaders sometimes load out a little longer than that, but that's the standard maximum as specified. Maximum chamber pressure is specified at 60,000 psi. Where does that fall? You know, it's fairly reasonable in the grand scheme of things. A lot of cartridges run up to 65,000 psi very comfortably, right? So this was established back when bolt actions were still relatively young, and although the 1903 Springfield, at least the ones with heat-treated receivers built after that 800,000 serial number mark, they can handle far more pressure than 60,000 psi. But you know, these engineers at the time were used to dealing with lever actions and the early bolt actions, the small ring Mausers and so forth that just weren't as strong as pretty much everything from about 1898 on. We'll call it, say, with that Mauser 98. And there are some other exceptions, but that's the classic known one. Standard performance through the 30-06. Let's look at bullets, weights, velocities with those weights, and then the energy they produce. So consulting my notes here, a 150 grain bullet is very common in a 30-06, but it's also commonly the entry point, right? The lightest weight that's regularly available. Generally is factory spec'd at about 2,910 feet per second. Of course, there's variation depending on barrel length and this specific factory load. Hand loaders can get a tad more. But with that standard, 2,910 feet per second, that 150 grain bullet generates 2,820 foot-pounds of kinetic energy at the muzzle. Next up in line, in the standard weight range, right, is the 165 grain bullet. And we can lump all the 168s in there as well. There's a lot of 168 grain match type bullets. More commonly used in the 308, but sometimes used in a 30-06. Those will typically exit the muzzle at about 2,800 feet per second out of factory ammunition. Again, give or take a little depending on barrel length and the specific factory load. This generates 2,870 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, or thereabouts. And then my favorite all-around bullet weight for the 30-06, the 180 grain weight range. And this can vary a tad. You might find some 175s like a Barnes 175 grain LRX or a 178 grain Hornady ELDX bullet, but the classic is the 180 grain. We can kind of lump all those together. They're typically going to exit the muzzle at about 2,700 feet per second. That's a very broad standard performance. And that generates just north of 2,900 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. Now, there are a lot of great bullets in that range, and even a decently built cup and core bullet, something like a Remington core locked, the traditional non-tipped version, will perform pretty well on game up to and including elk, right, at that velocity. Better yet are the bonded core versions. All-time favorite of mine is the 180 grain Nosler AccuBond. Just a real solid bullet that'll do darn near anything you ask it to on non-dangerous game, anything on the North American continent. Now, what about those outside the norm loads? We're talking lighter bullet weights and heavier bullet weights than that typical range. So there are 125 to 130 grain bullets. You can get anything from like a Nosler ballistic tip that'd be great for, calling large predators, things like that. Or 130 grain Barnes triple shock. That's actually a reasonably good hunting bullet for closer ranges because it goes real fast, going to mushroom real effectively. Doesn't have a lot of sectional density because it's so light, but thanks to its monometal construction, it'll hold together real well. And you can get a pretty impressive speed out of it. You can push that 130 grain Barnes bullet or 125 grain ballistic tip, something like that, at about 3,250 feet per second. Laser flat inside 200, 250 yards. They lose velocity real fast because they really don't have good aerodynamics. Let's jump now to the upper end of the spectrum and talk about the heavy bullets. And this is where the 30-06 stands head and shoulders above the 308. It's a distinct advantage that is scientifically quantifiable. You can't argue this one. So if you look at these two cartridges that I have here in front of me, here's the 30-06 and the 308. The 308 has a very compact, efficient shape. It has a relatively short neck, and any long, heavy bullet has to protrude way down inside that case. Well, that intrudes on the potential propellant capacity inside the case. The 30-06, on the other hand, has quite a long neck, and so longer bullets can protrude further down into the case without intruding onto the powder capacity much. Plus, look at the length of the body of that case. It's got a whole bunch more propellant capacity inside. Now, this translates into the ability to effectively shoot heavy 30 caliber bullets, something the 308 cannot do. Yeah, it can blow them out the muzzle, but they're going to be going so slow they're not useful for hunting purposes. They're going to already be down nearing that threshold where they're no longer going fast enough to expand on impact. The 30-06, on the other hand, handles them really well. let's talk about some specifics. A 200 grain bullet coming out of the 30-06 will do about 2,600 feet per second. Now we're going to see here in a little bit when we start looking at the 308 that nearly matches the standard velocity of a 165 grain bullet out of the 308. So with a 200 grain bullet, you've got some different ways you can go. You can go with something like, those of you watching on YouTube can see I've got a lineup of bullets here in front of me. Either a Hornady ELDX in the 200 grain weight range, or something like a Federal Terminal Ascent 200 grain bullet. If you can find them, they're scarce, right? Either of those is going to be a fantastic all-around bullet, and it's bordering on having real good aerodynamics. So it gives the 30-06 a lot more downrange capability than the 308 when it comes to on-impact authority. It's going to hold its velocity better and carry a lot more energy to impact, right? Plus it will buck the wind much, much better. Those are two really significant elements. And then, of course, you've got bullets like the Nosler 220 grain partition. This is one of the all-time great bullets in the 30-06 for your really heavy stuff. Moose, bison, interior grizzly bears, even your coastal brown bears. If you're going to hunt them with your 30-06, that's the bullet I would do it with. Just a fantastic choice. So, that 220 grain bullet, in case you're wondering, exits the muzzle of the 30-06. This is if you can find it in factory ammo, right? At about 2,500 feet per second. Hand loaders can do a bit better with that, and they can do a bit better than 2,600 feet per second with the 200 grain weight range. But the key point here is that the 30-06 is comfortable with bullets in that weight range. So we're achieving better aerodynamics that maintain impact velocity more effectively and hit a lot harder downrange. We're swinging a significantly heavier hammer for our whatever task it is at hand here than the 308 can ever swing. Okay, let's talk about some simple cartridge characteristics. We've talked about the powder capacity and the long neck. How about accuracy? I've seen some 30-06 rifles shoot real well. And in fact, between about, I'd say 1906 when it started being used and 1935, somewhere in there, the 30-06 was the dominating cartridge in the 1,000-yard competitions at the national matches at Camp Perry. And it won many, many times. I don't know how many times the 308 has won that particular match. It was called the Wimbledon match, right? I'm sure it may have done so once or twice. Well, I shouldn't say I'm sure. I don't really know. I know that in certain types of competition now, Palma and so forth, there are specified competitions that limit the shooter, to using a 308, and so they're forced to get the most they can out of that cartridge and compete at 1,000 yards with it as well. And with specialized hand loads, using small primer pockets, exceeding standard pressure limits, and single loading cartridges so they can load their bullets way out, right? So they're not intruding onto that minimal powder capacity that the cartridge has. You know, those shooters actually get it done, but it's not a practical application of the 308 at long range. Now, I can hear a lot of you out there in your mind just going, what's this guy talking about? I mean, it was the military sniper rifle cartridge for decades and decades. It's got to be good at long range. Well, folks, I hate to break it to you, but the military doesn't always use the most efficient tools for the task. And it's not a great long-range sniper cartridge. Even those guys will tell you that. I've got a lot of retired law enforcement friends and military friends, special forces guys, that use this cartridge. They were snipers, sniper team leaders. They used it in combat, and they love it because it served them well. But they'll be the first to tell you, oh, there's better cartridges once you get out past, X distance. It does pretty well to 600 yards or so if you got a human-sized target, but man, it's got a lot of wind drift and a lot of drop, And it's best suited, actually, for law enforcement tasks where I think the average sniping engagement is like between 15 and 80 yards because you're typically in urban environments, right? Very precise, very authoritative for those uses, but it's not in today's scene with our modern cartridges that are maximized for efficiency with super high BC bullets. It's not even a contender anymore. Actually, neither cartridge is between the .308 and the 30-06. But I'm off on a little bit of a tangent here. Let's get back to 30-06 accuracy. Friends, it's not an inherently accurate cartridge. Part of that is because factory ammunition has been built for so many years with hunting bullets and held to fairly loose tolerances. And hunting rifles were built the same. You know, chambers were fairly sloppy. It was more important to our ancestors to have a rifle that would run and go bang every time they cycled it than it was to place a shot on a teacup at 400 yards, right? And so a lot of those tolerances were actually built in. Well, they're not good for accuracy. Our modern cartridge design ethos dictates very minimal cartridge tolerances, and that's why cartridges such as the 6.5 Creedmoor, all the PRC family, the 6.8 Western, and so forth are so inherently accurate. Well, the 308 bridges that gap. We'll talk more about that when it's turn to be discussed. But I'll just put it this way. The 30-06 in a lot of hunting rifles, you know, you're doing well to get 1.25 inch to 1.5 inch three-shot groups at 100 yards. If you're hand loading, building precise ammo, and you've got a well-built custom rifle with a premium barrel, you can do a lot better than that. But it's not the norm, right? How about its reputation for killing? You know, the 30-06 in my experience does two things. With hand loads, it easily exceeds the advertised velocities that you can get at safe pressure thresholds. And in fact, a lot of factory ammo will exceed the numbers printed on the box. The 308's the other way around, especially with today's trends towards shorter barrels. The 30-06 kills really well. It tends to hit hard and very effectively put animals down. A few stories about that. You know, one of my favorite that I've read, of course I wasn't there, but was about Frank Glasser in the book Alaska's Wolfman. Written, I believe, by an author by the name of Jim Reardon. You can look it up online and find the book. And he talks about a point where he was actually sent out to remove a bunch of grizzlies in an area that had been overpopulated, hired by the government. And so he took his trusty 30-06 with 220 grain bullets and shot a whole bunch of them. Usually he'd put 1 to 3 or 4 shots in each bear, right? Grizzly bear. Well, he writes about finding 2 big boars in a big river bottom, one of those big wide gravel-filled ones with the little interlaced spider webs of streams, and they were about 200 yards apart, and he could see a ravine, one of these stream beds between them. So he just dropped into it, hunkered down, and went for it, and closed the distance, got right between the bears. He raised up and he shot one. Neither of them knew he was there at this point, and it dropped in its tracks, if I remember, roaring, and believing he'd broken its shoulder, which he probably had. He whipped around and shot the other one, which I think had stood up or just jumped at the shot, whatever, right? So he got a good hit on it. Well, it started coming for him, and he hit it, I believe, so there's 2 shots. He had 5 in his rifle. He hit it with his 3rd and 4th and put it down, and then he heard a roar behind him, another roar, and it seemed a lot closer than it should be, and he whipped around, and the other bear had got up and charged him. And he had 1 shot left in his rifle, and the bear was getting close. Thankfully, Frank Glasser was a man of very astute nerves, and he put his shot where it counted and dropped that bear, that charging bear right there. Just an awesome story that always raises the hair on the back of my neck when I think about it. You know, classic 30-06 in a Winchester Model 70 pre-64 rifle, controlled feed action. How much better can you get than that? Okay, let's talk about one other pertinent characteristic of the 2 cartridges before moving to the 308, and that is recoil level. Which one kicks more? Does one kick a lot more than the other? The answer is yes, and more than you might think. The 30-06 with that 180 grain, very well balanced bullet that I like so well at about 2,700 feet per second, when fired in an 8-pound rifle, will deliver 24.5 foot-pounds of recoil energy into your shoulder. That's not a ton, but it's plenty to notice, right, folks? And let's just jump right down while we're at it and look at the number on the 308, the similar number. With a 165 grain bullet, which I personally believe is a better balanced bullet weight for that cartridge, doing its standard, about 2,600 feet per second in a same weight rifle, 8-pound rifle, it will recoil 18.75 foot-pounds, not quite 19 foot-pounds of recoil energy that it's delivering into your shoulder, right? That, for the mathematicians among us, you already know this, that's about 25% less recoil. Fairly significant. Okay, so let's go ahead now and dive in deep on the 308. What is it great for? Well, first, let's talk some cartridge specifications. Overall length, standard overall max length is 2.8 inches. Of course, if you're hand loading and you have a long-ish magazine in your rifle, you can exceed that a little bit. A lot of factory loads will be a trace shorter than that, but not by much, because being a true short action cartridge, you have to maximize all the length you've got to try and get as much speed as you can out of the cartridge. Keeping the bullets loaded as long as possible gives you just a tiny bit more propellant capacity. Max pressure on the 308 is 62,000 psi, so you can tell right there that it's just a tad higher pressure cartridge than the 30-06, but it's not getting into that 64,000 to 65,000 psi realm that most of the real hot rods run at. We're talking cartridges like the Weatherby cartridges and even the 270 and so forth. What does your standard bullet weight performance look like? Again, most common bullet weights for the 308 are going to range from 150 grains up to 180 grains. And 180 is starting to push what it's really capable of. But let's start at the beginning like we did with the 30-06. That bullet, the 150 grain bullet, should exit your standard 308 barrel at about 2,820 feet per second. That is what? Just almost exactly 100 feet per second less than the 30-06. That generates 2,670 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. And I'm going to pause right here and just tell you, unlike in the 30-06 where I have absolutely no use for 150 grain bullets, I do like one specific bullet a lot in the 308 in the 150 grain weight range, and that is a Barnes 150 grain tipped triple shock. You can push them to pretty useful velocities and it will hold together and penetrate well on anything including elk, so it's a pretty good compromise for that cartridge. Next, we've got 165 grain bullets, and the standard velocity for that's going to be about 2,650 feet per second, and it will generate about 2,620 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. Now, this is with 24-inch barrels, folks. These velocity figures are generally measured out of a 24, even a 26-inch barrel. That's not common on a 308. These days especially, you'll see 308s with 22 and even 20-inch barrels, and with the popularity of suppressors skyrocketing, there's a lot of 18 and even 16-inch 308 barrels out there. And when you start with a relatively low muzzle velocity to begin with, and then you chop off up to 6 or 8 inches of barrel, you lose a lot of speed. And this cartridge can very easily fall below useful thresholds for hunting. Let's say, for instance, you chop that 24-inch barrel down to 16 inches. Now that 165 grain bullet that should be going 2,650 feet per second, say you're losing 250 feet per second, now you're starting at 2,400 feet per second. That's 30-30 speeds, folks. And within 200 or 300 yards, it's going to be going less than 2,000 feet per second, which for me is my personal minimum impact velocity threshold, because I've seen bullets do wonky things, fail to expand and so forth, below 2,000 feet per second. Even those that are rated to expand well at lower speeds, I just like 2,000 or more. So that's one way that you can price yourself right out of some extended hunting capability with your 308 if your barrel's too short. Let's talk about the 180 grain bullet now. Your standardized velocity will be about 2,590 feet per second. And that varies, of course, depending on the factory ammo, who loaded it, the bullet type, and of course your bullet, your barrel length. A 24-inch barrel should give you that. A 20-inch barrel is going to lose you. It's put you down in the 24s, and a 16-inch barrel you'll be shooting probably in the 22s, somewhere in there, 100 feet per second. Not very impressive. So that's kind of the top end. That's where the 308 reaches its useful limit in terms of bullet weight. Occasionally you'll find a specialized load heavier than that. Maybe a subsonic load pushing a heavier bullet, but that's a totally different sort of topic, right? How about outside the norm loads like we talked about with the 30-06? There aren't any that are real useful. The 130 grains, yeah, you can play around with them, but you're not getting enough speed to be really impressive on much of anything, and they're just not capable with the heavy for caliber 30 caliber bullets like we talked about before. So let's look at this lineup here that I've got in front of me, those of you that can see, and just talk about some examples. Right here is a 150 grain flat based lead tipped bullet. I believe that one's a Hornady Interlock. Just a classic bullet, very well liked among whitetail deer hunters. Good serviceable bullet inside reasonable ranges, right? Not my favorite bullet, and I'll just leave it at that. No, I won't. I'll say one more thing. I've lost a fair amount of game with that bullet. I don't use it anymore. But for whitetails, it's pretty good. Next to it is a 165 grain Sierra Game King bullet. This is a pretty good 308 bullet. You can push it to reasonable velocities. It doesn't have a great BC, but it's not a horrendous BC. It's not really tough enough for elk, but if you just shoot one through the lungs, it'll do fine. And it's really good for deer, whether it's whitetail deer, mule deer, antelope-sized game, whatnot. And then next to that is this 150 grain tip triple shock that I like a lot. It's in fact, earlier on I pointed at the wrong one. This is a 175 grain Barnes LRX. This one right here by this 308 Cartridge is the 150 grain tip triple shock, and it's a great bullet. I've used that out to 420 yards on antelope, as close as 18 yards on black bears out of the 308. Does a good job. That bullet and the 165 grain Nosler Accubon, I don't have one here to show you, but it would look something like this Sierra Game King with a tip like this 180 grainer over on the 30-06. Anyway, I digress. Those two are probably my favorite 308 bullets. Now, in the middle, I've got a 180 grain Nosler partition bullet between the 30-06 and the 308. It's one of the all-time great deer and elk bullets in 30 caliber firearms. Not super aerodynamic, but for use out to 400-450 yards in a 30-06, it's fantastic. And I can say the same thing in the 308 out to about 250 to 300 yards, depending on your barrel length, your personal setup, right? So if you hunt timber country and you're hunting elk, that's a great choice. Another one is the 180 grain Nosler Accubon. It's a good bonded bullet. Give you a little better aerodynamics than the 180 grain partition, but it won't penetrate quite as deeply. So that's kind of just, it goes to show you there's not a whole lot of middle ground. Where the 308 tops out in bullet weight, the 30-06 really gets going, and it goes on up through the 175 grain, 180 grain monometals. It can handle those. Of course, monometal bullets being made of a copper or a copper alloy that's less dense than lead, they're always longer than similar weight lead core bullets. So they take up more propellant capacity. That's why a 308 is really best off with a 150 grain monometal, but the 30-06 does well up to and including the 180 monometals, and then bullets, of course, like that Hornady ELDX 200 grainer, the Federal Terminal Ascent 200 grainer, and then that Sledgehammer 220 grain nozzle partition. Just for fun, this is a total side topic, but I've got another bullet here. It's long and streamlined and shaped like a tiny missile. It's a 208 grain Barnes LRX bullet designed specifically for the 300 PRC, which is probably the best versatile, hard-hitting, longer range. You know, we're not talking crazy stuff, but long-range hunting cartridge on the market today. Compare that, those of you that are watching, to the 180 grain nozzle partition. It makes it look stubby and chunky, right? The 30-06 can't shoot this bullet either, and the 308 would be helpless with it. You'd have to single load it, right? And it would be so slow, it would be almost pathetic. But that is just a little reminder on how far projectiles have come in the past 30 or 40 years, particularly really the last 15 years, in enhancing our downrange killing ability. And I don't mean increasing distance. I mean these bullets buck the wind less, so we place our shots better, and they carry a lot more energy to the target, and they will expand more reliably on impact because they have more velocity. So even if you're not an extended range shooter, a bullet like that is an advantage. But that was just kind of a little bit of a center interjection in this discussion to show what these two classic cartridges are up against in the modern cartridge realm. Okay, characteristics of the 308. It's a short action cartridge, and if you care about that, that means a lot to you. A little bit lighter action, a little bit shorter, faster bolt throw, right? Easier for small frame shooters, whether you're kids, women, or just a small frame man, to handle. It's a thing. Unlike the 30-06, the 308 is wonderfully accurate, inherently. It's just a terrific choice if you really want to shoot sub-inch groups out of a standard hunting rifle. It's incapable with heavy for caliber bullets. I've got that on my notes here, and we've gone over that a lot, but I've got some bullet points as to the, that pertain to the ramifications of this characteristic. It eliminates true long-range hunting potential, if you care about that, right? And it reduces its usefulness on elk and bigger game. Because an elk, I mean, let's face it, the average mature bull is 4 times as heavy as the average mature whitetail. Shouldn't you be shooting a bigger bullet? Darn right you should. It also reduces its usefulness on big game past about 350 yards or so, depending, of course, on your barrel length and how much speed you're getting out of your 308. Also, in factory ammo, my personal experience, I find that the 308 usually falls short of advertised velocities. And the shorter your barrel length is, obviously scientifically predictable, the less velocity you're going to have compared to those numbers on the box. There's that recoil level. We talked about this. Not quite 19 foot-pounds of recoil energy hitting your shoulder, as opposed to 24.5 with the 30-06. Theoretically, this should make the 308 cartridge easy to kill with, right? Because it makes it more easily shot accurately. But in my personal experience, this is just me, and I know a lot of you listening have had a very different experience with the 308. I've lost more game with the 308 Winchester than any other cartridge. I'm not proud of that, but it's a fact. It's documentable. It's in my notes, my stories of the past. I'll tell you about 2 of them. One is an Axis deer, and I was shooting a 150 grain flat core, or flat based lead core, cupping core type bullet. Took a shot at 130 yards, not far, plenty of steam left, right? And as I fired, as the rifle was in recoil, I saw this Axis buck in Texas take a step. He was quartering very slightly toward me, and instead of hitting him on the shoulder, I hit him a couple inches behind the crease behind the shoulder and single lunged him. Well, he took off, And we tried to track him. Just found a few little drops of stomach matter, and then lost him. And we looked for 2.5 days before we finally found him by the smell, a ways off. And I can't help feeling if I'd had either a cartridge that was a little faster in velocity, funny enough, my bullet might have got there more quickly and might have clipped the back lobe of both lungs, or if I'd had a heavier bullet. So this is not necessarily the cartridge's fault, right? If I'd had a bonded core or a monometal bullet that would have driven through, blown a good sized exit hole out the backside, we'd have had some tracking blood. But it is what it is, right? The other one that I lost was almost as heart-wrenching, maybe more, I don't know. I was in Europe on a driven wild boar hunt in Germany. I've got ancestors from there. Was in a high stand the second day, and I had a great first day. I'd shot 3 mouflon and a wild boar, and just a terrific experience all around. Well, I heard a sound behind me, and I stood up, and there was a tall back on this particular high seat. It's just like a wooden box built on stilts, right? So I stood up on the bench I'd been sitting on and peeked over, and there's this big wild boar trotting toward me, maybe 40 yards off at an angle. And I couldn't get the rifle up. I couldn't stand on tiptoes high enough to get my rifle over that wall of that high seat. So instead, I kind of wrapped myself around the corner and waited for the boar to trot past and come into view. When he did, I was kind of standing on one foot and contorted around the corner of this thing, and I could not keep my crosshairs on him. So I had to kind of quickly regroup, place my feet better, get my elbows down on the rails of that high seat, and take better aim. And by this time, the boar was quartering steeply away. And I put the crosshairs on his right hip, kind of right on that big ham, and fired. Not even thinking about the cartridge and the bullet that I was shooting. I'm used to shooting elk bullets, folks. It's what I pick for all of my standard go-to Western hunting rifles. And my crosshairs were directing that bullet straight up through that hind quarter and through the vitals into the offside shoulder, which if I'd been shooting a monometal bullet, it would have broke probably the quarter on entry side and the front shoulder on the exit side. Probably would have come to rest in that shoulder, but it should have dropped that boar right there. And he took off. And they brought dogs in. They searched for him. They jumped him. They followed him more with dogs. I'm talking about the gamekeepers, right? They don't necessarily let you get in the fray after a thing like this. They let me come along, but I had to stand back, and I wasn't handed my loaner rifle. Fair enough. They've got dogs fighting a wild boar and themselves with firearms. They don't want some unknown quantity from across the pond wading in and getting trigger happy. I totally understood that. But we never did recover that boar. The bullet I shot him with is a great deer bullet for the 308, 178 grain Hornady ELDX. But once I sat back and thought about it, and about the angle on that big wild boar, I probably had to go through 12 inches of heavy hindquarter muscle and bone before I got into the paunch, then through, 6 or 8 inches of paunch before getting into the vitals. I didn't have the bullet for that. If I'd have been shooting a 30-06 with a bonded core bullet, maybe. Anyway, a couple of my sob stories, those things that make you think back with regret and try and plan and do things differently in the future, right? We got to learn from our experiences. All right, a few head-to-head comparisons between the 308 and the 30-06. Ammo availability and rifle availability are a wash. Both are super common. You're going to find a little better selection of hunting ammo in the 30-06, but a little better selection of target ammo in the 308. They're both really, really common. It's just, I can't call a winner there. In that category, it's definitely a draw. Accuracy. The 308 is more inherently accurate. So that category goes to the 308. Authority. The 30-06 is incontestably more powerful. These are two of the defining characteristics that will make me always maintain that the cartridges are not that similar. The 308's more accurate, easily accurate. The 30-06 is simply more authoritative. When you use the bullets, it's really good with. As I mentioned, the 308 comes in a lot more match type ammo. So if you do want to shoot little competitions and whatnot with your 308, that's a better choice. With your rifle, I should say. And the 30-06, lots more loads tailored for big-bodied game. And yeah, you can get some pretty gnarly stout loads out there that'll take on grizzly, moose, whatever, if you look hard enough. So, in the final analysis, which is better? It really boils down to one simple thing, folks. If you never hunt big game that weighs more than about 300 pounds, and you never shoot past about 300 yards, the 308 is absolutely a better choice. Hands down, it is a superior cartridge for those uses. On the other hand, if you hunt game heavier than 300 pounds, and if you at least sometimes, ranging all the way up to commonly, shoot past 300 yards, the 30-06 is hands down the better choice. It is superior for both of those purposes. So, I've got a final thought for you before we wrap up here, folks. But first, let me just extend an invitation, if you'd be so kind. Jump on whatever listening platform you use and rate and review the show. We're in the summer doldrums right now, folks. This is the hardest time as a podcast because folks aren't looking forward to big hunting seasons right around the corner, and they tend to be out mowing their lawn and fishing rather than listening to podcasts. So helps make it visible and helps it grow a little bit if you'll rate and review. Also join us on patreon.com/backcountry. You can join as a free member and get access to some of our bonus material. We really appreciate it if instead you join as a contributing member. Contribute a little bit each month to the financial health of the podcast. That helps us keep doing what we're doing. And for those of you already on board doing this, I cannot tell you, I can't express how much that helps. And one other thing, my son William, our own backcountry apprentice, right, does our segment for Timney Triggers. He is editing and publishing most of these podcast episodes now on YouTube. We just called it the Backcountry Hunting Podcast channel on YouTube. And we try and do bonus material there as well. Some little shorts showing cool rifles, cool cartridges, cool shots, and some rifle reviews as well. I should say reviews of hunting equipment. Everything from backpacks to boots. And of course rifles is a big love of mine. So give him some support. He's just a kid, but he's already more tech savvy than me. He's doing a terrific job, and he's working real hard. A lot of long hours each week on this channel. So give him a subscribe and watch a few of his videos and like them for me. It's a personal favor to me. I'd sure appreciate it, folks. All right, here's the final thought. Both the 308 and the 30-06 are wonderful, practical cartridges. But no matter what anybody tells you, they are distinctly different. That's kind of the mantra I've been pounding through this whole episode, right? Here's the key. Pick the one that suits your needs, folks, and then practice with it so you get the best that cartridge has to offer. I'm Joseph Von Benedict, and I'll see you in the backcountry.